Hello everybody, today I will show you about how to use state, and we are talking about the life cycle of a React component. So we start with the previous project with the default project here, and inside this we have a default render, and I render this heading one to the use interface, and here is some libraries that we import. I define a class. This class means a React component defined as a class. You can define it as a function, as in the previous lesson. And this extend or inherit the React component. Inside this, I initialize and using the constructor. The constructor has input is prop mean properties. Inside the constructor, I initialize the parent class or the component class, and I use it. I can press super here to add the default constructor of the parent class, and inside this I remember that it is a React component. Super open the props, it means that it calls the initialization of React.component class. This is when it is called all the property of the parent class is initialized. And here I define the state. This state means private property. I can use a private property to use some private internal property, and it may not be inserted by the input parameter. And inside this I define an object which second is property second is 0, and it means that this dot state dot seconds is equal to 0. So I initialize this here, and I use it second this property to increment when I press the button. Here is a function render. The render function will generate all of the property to the user interface in HTML. Inside this we return an element, and the element here will contain the div or division. I add a div here. Inside the div we can have a heading 1, heading 2, paragraph. So I add heading 1, which the content is this is a counting machine. It means that inside this we have the heading 1 and some of other elements. So this state here, if we want to display here, I can use heading 2. So heading 2 seconds semicolon. So I use a curly brace to display the property that this dot state dot second. It is a property second of the state, and it also private because the state is private, and the second also private. S means second. So here I replace this with the element, the React element, and I add the counter here. You see that no property. You can see that it is quite simple because it does not contain any property, because this dot state is a private property. So here we need not to insert it inside the counter. I open in the web by npm start. Yes, you can see that here, but I want to increase it for each of 1 second. So what can I do? Here I open the code and define here the component did mount. It means that when the component is initialized for the first time, it will call to this function. It is a callback function, and it is called after it calls the constructor, and when the object or class is created or rendered to the DOM object, it will call to this. And what about this function? This function call when the component is removed. And this function is very important when I want to initialize some properties from variable, and after it will unmount, I will release the memory of the property. And here I want to increase the second. I define the function to increase the second. Increment counter. This function will increase the second property. So this dot state is equal to this dot state plus 1. It is right. Do you think it is right? It is correct or not? It is wrong, because you must use the setter here. This is wrong. It is not permitted, or you have to use the setter of the React to use it. You cannot assign it as here. You only use the setter, and the setter, like the setter, I call the set state. Set state means the setter function, and inside the set state we can assign the value of state. Very easy. So we have the arrow function. Previous state, pref state means the previous state or the state before we change, and this syntax is a around function, and on this around function inside here is asynchronous, and it will synchronize the document object model object. And here we implement the arrow function. Inside the arrow function we can increment the state, or increment the second property is a state by second. Here is a new second. Here is the previous state dot second plus 1. I can see that it is the previous state, and the second in the left is the new state, is the new second of state. And after running this, it will automatically render the DOM object and resynchronize it to resynchronize the user interface. Here is the component did mount. When it mount, I will call the set interval function. The set interval function will call the function inside it for periods of time, and it will count repeatedly. And inside here we have the first parameter is the function. The function that call is this dot increment counter. I will call to the this. So if I want to call this for 1000 millisecond, what can I do? I add it here 1000. 1000 here is 1000 millisecond, and after 1000 millisecond it will call this function repeatedly. And so it is a function that when we call this, the render will automatically refresh the user interface, and when the component is dismount or is removed, I call the clear interval this dot time ID. Time ID is a property we call to define in inside this counter class. Okay, You can see that it will automatically increase as you see 1 to 3 seconds, right?